Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the host and the content director at Word on Fire. Bishop Barron is not with us again this week, but I promise it'll be the last week. Next week, he will be back in studio with us for a brand new episode of the show. But this week, we're going to finish up the episode we started last week, which was based around Bishop Barron's talk titled David Dancing Before the Ark. The talk focuses on David, the kingly figure at the heart of 1st and 2nd Samuel in the Bible. Bishop Barron wrote his own commentary on 2 Samuel as part of the Brazos Theological Commentary series, and you can pick up your copy of that book today for a special discount. If you visit the website wordonfire.org/Samuel, that's wordonfire.org/Samuel, and then use the coupon code SAM5 during the checkout. That's SAM5. You'll save $5 when you order your copy of the book today. So sit back and enjoy this second half of Bishop Barron's great talk, David Dancing Before the Ark.
The sheer weirdness of God's act would help to explain why, quote, David was angry because the Lord had burst forth with an outburst upon Uzzah. It's 2 Samuel 6:8. Robert Alter renders the Hebrew here as afraid of the Lord, and the ambivalence is eloquent. For both anger and fear would indeed be understandable reactions to the disorienting sublimity of God. To be sure, in a pastoral context, the Christian minister often discovers that anger at and fear of God are very common states of soul among those who are striving to believe in God. On account of this anger, fear, David resolved not to bring the ark into his capital, and instead had it sent, quote, to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite, close quote, most likely a Philistine from Gath, who had attached himself to David during the time when David was a vassal of the king of Gath. In the earlier sections of the so-called Ark narrative, the presence of the Ark of the Covenant in the temple of the Philistines had caused, as we saw, the foreign gods to fall. Now, however, while the sacred vessel resides in the house of a Philistine within Israel, quote, the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and all his household, 2 Samuel 6:11. Is there a foreshadowing here of the ingathering of the nations, a hint of the blessings that would come to the peoples of the world when they ordered themselves to the right praise of God? Inspired by this benediction of Obed-Edom's home, David endeavored anew to bring the ark into its proper house in Jerusalem. What ensued was one of the richest and most festive liturgical processions described in the Bible. The king was careful not to make the same mistake he'd made before, hauling the ark by ox cart. This time he arranged for bearers to carry the ark by poles set through rings, as Exodus specified. Further, he ordered that when the bearers had taken but 6 steps, they sacrificed, quote, an ox and a fatling. There's some ambiguity here. Does the author mean to insinuate that the procession stopped every 6 paces to sacrifice, or simply they did so at the beginning of the march? If the former were true, the parade would have been endless and Israel would have been emptied of oxen. But in either case, the point is made that the ark is conduced in a festive but sacrificial attitude, the people aware both of their blessing and of their sin. In the killing of the animals, we see an anticipation of the thousands upon thousands of sacrifices that would take place over the centuries in the Jerusalem temple. Though the practice is, of course, utterly alien to us, the logic of sacrifice is actually quite straightforward. One returns to God some aspect of creation in order to signal one's gratitude for the whole of creation, or for a blessing received, or in reparation for sins committed. Again, the creator of the universe cannot possibly need anything in the universe, but the offer of the sacrifice needs the act of sacrifice in order to become rightly ordered to God. Further, sacrifices involve the death of an animal, so that the inner pain of this reorientation might be adequately symbolized. This great sacrificial procession, evocative of the entire sacrificial history and attitude of Israel, was presided over by the one who's not only king, but priest as well. The priesthood of David is unmistakably referenced in the garb the king dons for the parade. Quote, he was girded with a linen ephod, 2 Samuel 6:14. In the description of the priestly vestments to be worn by Aaron and his sons, the ephod is mentioned a number of times. And in Leviticus we hear that Moses, quote, brought Aaron and his sons forward and washed them in water. He put the tunic on him, fastened the sash around him, clothed him with the robe, and put the ephod on him. That's Leviticus 8:6. Most tellingly for our purposes, Saul, having invaded the sanctuary of Nob in search of David, ordered Doeg the Edomite to kill the priests. We are told, quote, on that day he killed 85 who wore the linen ephod. 1 Samuel 22:18. Quite clearly, David had decided, in putting on the garment of the priesthood, to assume the role and take up the task of those fallen victims of Saul. But he was also hearkening back to Samuel, Eli, and the Aaronic priesthood, as well as the priesthood of Adam, the first one to assume the stance of adoration. And only in light of the connection to Adam can we fully understand the energetic dance of the king before the ark of the Lord. Before the fall, Adam would have walked in easy fellowship with Yahweh, thinking his thoughts, moving as he moved. He danced, you might say, in unison with the Lord. What is sin but a falling out of step with God, an insistence upon dancing to one's own rhythm? The whole of the history of salvation, therefore, might be characterized as Yahweh's attempt to restore the sacred dance, to get his human creatures to move with him. Accordingly, David, dancing with energy before the ark, is humanity dancing with the Lord, recovering the effortless harmony of Eden. It's been argued that the gestures and movements of the priests in the Jerusalem temple were intended to mimic in a stylized way the exuberant dance of the king. And since the ritual moves of the Byzantine and Catholic Mass trace their origins to the temple, we could conclude that the processions, gestures, and bows of Christian priests today participate in the priesthood of the king who wore the ephod as he danced before the ark. I'd wager there's still another element of the story that makes it puzzling for most moderns, namely why David and his people would be dancing before, of all things, the law. As we saw, the ark contained manna on the staff of Aaron, but it contained most importantly the tablets of the Ten Commandments, the rather strict provisions and prohibitions given by Yahweh to Moses on Sinai. Most reasonable people in the West today would accept the law, from traffic regulations to required income tax, as a necessary evil, something that, in the best of all possible worlds, they would do without. Therefore, it would be difficult to imagine anyone dancing with joy before the tax code or the latest prescriptions determined by a county board, or even before the Constitution. To understand the coherence of David's dance, we have to grasp the sea change that occurred from biblical to modern times in regard both to law and to freedom. On the modern reading, freedom is primarily choice and self-determination. The roots of this view stretch back to the late medieval period, to the speculations of William of Ockham. For the English Franciscan, human freedom is utterly autonomous, for it's the capacity to choose on the basis of no constraint, either interior or exterior. The sheer independence of the will, he argued, is proved by an act of suicide committed by a sincere religious believer, for such a move against the supreme good is made in the presence of the supreme good. The contemporary Thomist Serve Pincair's refers to this Ockhamist notion as, quote, the freedom of indifference, for it's predicated on the assumption that the free agent hovers indifferently above the yes and the no. An implication of this way of construing freedom is that each moral act is monadic, something like a Whiteheadian actual occasion. Precisely because the truly free choice can be determined by nothing whatsoever, neither the character of the agent nor the succession of his previous moral moves can have a determining influence on his present ethical choice. On this interpretation, law must be seen as a limitation on freedom, and hence, as at best, a necessary evil. Freedom perforce will chafe against the law, and law by its very nature will set limits to unruly freedom. Moreover, when Occam extrapolates theologically from this construal of freedom, he arrives indeed at an understanding of God as supremely arbitrary power. And since the divine freedom is as unconstrained in its essence as human freedom, infinite and finite liberty will necessarily confront each other as opponents, and their relationship will be mediated only by a divine law powerfully imposed. Many have argued that this account of the God-human relationship conduced by a few short logical steps to atheism. For such a God will inevitably be seen as a threat to human flourishing. Hence Feuerbach can conclude, the no to God is a yes to man. And Sartre would formulate the pithy syllogism, quote, if God exists, I cannot be free, but I am free. Therefore, God does not exist. All that follows, it seems to me, from this Ockhamist construal of freedom. But prior to Occam, there was a very different notion of freedom, what Pinker's calls liberté de qualité, freedom for excellence. Here, freedom is not primarily choice and self-creation, but the disciplining of desire in order to make the achievement of the good first possible and then effortless. So one becomes a free player of the violin, capable of playing any type of music, precisely in the measure that one submits to a range of disciplines, laws, and practices. One becomes a free swinger of the golf club, able to respond effortlessly to the shifting demands of the game, inasmuch as one has internalized the laws and rules that govern good swinging. On this interpretation, law is not the opponent of freedom, but rather the condition for its possibility. A most important concomitant of this notion is a view articulated in the philosophical anthropology of Aquinas, namely that will is a function of intellect. For Aquinas, the will emerges at the moment when the mind understands the good as good. And this entails that the objective good never stands over and against freedom as a constraint, but rather informs it and guides it at every turn. And the theological implications are significantly non-Occamist. God is free not inasmuch as he stands in sovereign indifference to the yes and the no, but inasmuch as he can only say yes. That is, in the measure that his will is utterly congruent with the goodness of his being. God and freedom so construed, the divine will is not a threat to human flourishing, just the contrary. And hence the sacred law is indeed something in the presence of which a grateful humanity might be tempted to dance. I'll make a final set of observations, associations before turning from David's dance. A connection that the fathers of the church made with particular enthusiasm was between the Ark of the Covenant, which bore the divine law, and Mary of Nazareth, who bore the divine presence in the fullest possible sense. Hence Maximus of Turin says, quote, "But what would we say the Ark was if not Holy Mary, since the Ark carried within it the tables of the covenant, while Mary bore the master of that same covenant?" Close quote. One of the many artistic depictions of this patristic association is the relief of a juxtaposed Marian ark, which is carved in stone over the left portal at Notre Dame in Paris. A number of symbolic echoes now can be heard. David arose and went to get the ark, which was in the house of Abinadab, situated, as we heard, on a hill, probably a shrine in the country of Judah. And in the Gospel of Luke, we're told that just after the Annunciation, quote, "Mary set out and went in haste to a Judean town in the hill country, where she entered the house of Zechariah and greeted Elizabeth." Luke 1:39. In other words, the supreme ark, like its prototype, situates itself on a hilltop shrine in Judea. I don't say shrine casually here, for Zechariah is a temple priest, and Elizabeth a descendant of Aaron, the first priest. Further, after the death of Uzzah, David said, quote, "How can the ark of the Lord come into my care?" 2 Samuel 6:9. And upon receiving her cousin, Elizabeth said, quote, "And why has this happened to me, that the mother of my Lord comes to me?" Luke 1:43. Both David and Elizabeth are unworthy to be in the presence of the bearer of the Lord. The king danced with all his might before the ark, and, quote, "When Elizabeth heard Mary's greeting, the child leaped in her womb." Luke 1:41. The unborn John the Baptist performing an infant's dance in the presence of the true ark. Finally, an intriguing detail, after the Uzzah incident, David sent the ark, as we saw, to the home of Obed-Edom, where it stayed for 3 months. And after delivering her great Magnificat, quote, "Mary remained with her, Elizabeth, about 3 months, and then returned to her home." Luke 1:56. There can be little doubt that Luke is consciously echoing these stories of the ark in order to highlight Mary's identity as Theotokos. Now, as the procession wound its way into the city, it caught the attention of Michal, the daughter of Saul, the first wife of David, who watched from a window high above the scene. We are told, quote, "She despised him in her heart." 2 Samuel 6:16. We can only begin to imagine the texture of her feelings at this point in the narrative. She had witnessed the deaths of her father and brother and the fall of Saul's kingdom. Her husband had gone on to marry several other women and fathered children with them, while she remained childless. And David had her beloved second husband torn away from her as part of a cynical political game. Certainly she had a right to feel angry and resentful toward the one whom she knew as an upstart shepherd boy who would now become king in the place of Saul and instead of Jonathan. Significantly, Michal is referred to in this short section not as the wife of David, but consistently as the daughter of Saul, signaling that she represents the fading house of the former king. That she gazes down from a window rather than participating in the celebration indicates that she represents the Saulite past. From her height, she regards David with the same haughty disdain that her father once showed to his rival. Before resuming the story of Michal, the narrator lingers over David's performance of a variety of priestly and kingly tasks. First, he established the ark in its tent or tabernacle within the holy city, thus anticipating the eventual installation of the ark in a proper temple by his son Solomon. Next, he offered up burnt offerings and offerings of well-being, two prototypes of what would become temple sacrifice. And finally, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts. 2 Samuel 6:18. Going into the ark, offering sacrifice, and then returning to bless the assembled crowd, David is anticipating the moves of the high priest on the Day of Atonement, reconciling Yahweh and Israel and establishing a new garden. Finally, David performed a distinctively kingly act, feeding, quote, the whole multitude of Israel, both men and women, to each a cake of bread, a portion of meat, and a cake of raisins. 2 Samuel 6:19. Here he's Moses, who promised to give the people food and drink during their sojourn in the desert. And he's Joshua, who pledged to bring Israel to a land flowing with milk and honey. And he's Adam, sharing the fruitfulness of the garden. The ark, which was constructed in the shadow of Sinai, had finally found a resting place, and Jerusalem was thereby established as the center of Israelite worship, the still point around which the nation could turn. After performing these priestly and kingly functions, David returned home to his less than contented wife. Astonishingly, the conversation that follows is the only dialogue between Michal and David recorded in the Samuel literature. In 1 Samuel 19, she had urgently instructed David to flee from Saul, but we heard nothing of David's response to her in that episode. When we finally hear them speak to one another, we perceive only sarcasm, anger, and recrimination. Not content to wait for her husband to come in, Michal went out with energy to meet him and then poured invective into his ear. Quote, how the king of Israel honored himself today, uncovering himself today before the eyes of his servants' maids, as any vulgar fellow might shamelessly uncover himself. 2 Samuel 6:20. The verb for uncovering clearly has a sexual connotation, reflecting Michal's insinuation that David had crudely been offering his nakedness for the delighted contemplation of slave girls. There's no question there's more than a hint of sexual jealousy in Michal's observation, as well as a foreshadowing of dangers to come through David's sexual imprudence. But the king's willingness to expose his nakedness, even in that most public of settings, also harkens back to the garden and the time before the fall, when Adam and Eve walked unselfconsciously naked in one another's presence and in the sight of the Lord. That the nakedness of David is revealed precisely in the act of worship only reinforces the connection to the Adam of innocent prelapsarian adoratio. The king's response to his first wife is both psychologically devastating and theologically interesting. Quote, it was before the Lord, who chose me in place of your father and all your household, to appoint me as prince over Israel, the people of the Lord, that I have danced before the Lord. 2 Samuel 6:21. With those words, David put paid to the notion that the house of Saul would have any say in the governance of Israel. It had perhaps been the hope of Saul in his more lucid moments that his house would endure precisely through the son of David and Michal. But Saul himself, when the wicked spirit was upon him, had so interrupted their marriage that no progeny came from it. Now David is definitively shutting the door on that possibility, and thereby shutting down the Saulite line. Moreover, the decision of David is given quasi-divine sanction, since a sort of curse settled upon her from that moment. Quote, and Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child to the day of her death. 2 Samuel 6:23. Now, I said David's rejoinder was also theologically interesting, and this for several reasons. First, we see the paradox that a person's debasement before God is tantamount not to diminution, but to elevation and enhancement. If one human being debased himself before another, such an act would indeed be humiliating and dehumanizing. For a competitiveness or zero-sum dynamic does obtain among finite things. However, as I've been saying over and over, the Creator God is not one being, however supreme among many. And therefore, there is no ontological competition between him and creatures. God does not stand over and against the world, but exists precisely as the ground of the world's existence. Accordingly, the debasement of a human being before God does not result in that person's annihilation, but rather in his fulfillment. It's this very paradoxical quality of the biblical God's relationship with humanity that permits St. Irenaeus to assert the glory of God as a human being fully alive. And this is why David can honor Yahweh precisely through an exuberant dance and in the spirit of joy. Secondly, the episode sheds considerable light on the relationship between political power and the authority of God. King David's obeisance before God is a clear indication that he realizes his worldly rule must be situated in the context of God's providence and placed upon the foundation of moral principles derived from God. Once more, the correlation to the kingship of Adam is illuminating. The first man functioned as a good ruler of Eden as long as he was obedient to the divine word and responsive to the promptings of the divine spirit. But his kingship foundered the moment he seized for himself the prerogative of determining the difference between good and evil, when he arrogated to himself the power to establish the moral foundation for his kingly choices. This move, which is functionally equivalent to the suspension of orthodoxy, leads inevitably to expulsion from the garden and to loss of rule. Once more, the whole of the biblical narrative, from Genesis to the account of David's kingly dance, might be construed as the story of humanity struggling to recover the right relationship between human and divine authority. Again and again, the biblical authors tell us that earthly kings are rightly conceived under the aegis of God, and they consistently show us the devastation, both personal and societal, that follows from the laying aside of this truth. The lords of the Tower of Babel, the Pharaoh of the Exodus, the kings of the Amalekites and Philistines, all recapitulate the sin of Adam and set themselves up as the criterion of good and evil. But Israel in principle was meant to be the countersign, a corporate Adam, a people whose political and cultural life unfolded according to God's will and principle. In his treatise on law, Thomas Aquinas teaches that positive law, which is to say the concrete prescriptions by which society is governed, is derivative from the natural law, the first principles of morality and their immediate applications, which in turn is grounded in the eternal law, which is none other than the reasonability of the divine mind itself. When this nesting relationship is overlooked, positive law becomes but an expression of the will to power of the legislator, and the moral integrity of a society so governed is fatally compromised. At least a vestige of this Thomistic understanding can be discerned in the American Declaration of Independence, precisely in its affirmation of the rights to life, liberty, and happiness, explicitly recognized as, quote, endowed by the Creator. The implication is that the positive laws which will govern the United States must be correlated to the objective moral principles articulated as rights, which in turn are implanted in us by God. Joseph Ratzinger proposes a reading of Jesus' conversation with Pilate, which is apposite here. Under pressure from the restive crowd, Pilate both abdicates moral responsibility and confesses ignorance of any objective ground for moral decision-making. What is the truth? Having severed any possible link between positive law and natural law, he surrenders to the whim of the crowd, asking them to decide whether an obviously guilty man or an obviously innocent man should be released. This, Ratzinger argues, is the prototype of the moral governance by public opinion poll so prevalent in our society today. But what the severance of positive moral and eternal law inevitably results in is, as we saw, the ultimacy of the legislator's will to power. Thus Pilate bullyingly says to Jesus, "Do you refuse to speak to me? Don't you know I have the power to release you or the power to crucify you?" To which the one who came to testify to the truth said, quote, "You would have no power over me unless it had been given to you from above." Pilate's authority, the legitimacy of which Jesus does not question, is nevertheless subalternate to the higher authority of God. David the king who dances with joyful reverence before God is an apt iconic representation of this truth. A third theological implication of David's response to Michal is that in a properly religious context, the ecstatic trumps the rational and the moralistic. In a certain sense, Michal was right in critiquing the king for a somewhat imprudent display. It would not be hard to find altogether respectable and reasonable moral categories, according to which David's dance would be characterized as inappropriate. Perhaps he truly gave scandal to some in Jerusalem that day and was the occasion for lustful thoughts in others. The prim, downward-looking Michal aptly symbolizes the moral dimension that's legitimately part of religion. You might say she's sort of ancient Israelite Kant, for whom religion was entirely a matter of morality, rationally construed. Kant's programmatic text, religion within the limits of reason alone, gives away the nature of the project. But as Paul Tillich once argued, real religion can never be captured within the limits of reason alone, precisely because it involves the honoring of the unconditioned. Whatever can be grasped by reason is ipso facto conditioned. Therefore, the relationship to the properly unconditioned must involve the bursting of the bonds of reason, an ecstatic leap outside of the self and beyond the controlling aspect of the mind. John Henry Newman speaks of the kingly, prophetic, and priestly dimensions of the church. In its kingly mode, the church is marked by order, authority, discipline. In its prophetic mode, it's rational, inquisitive, engaged in dialogue with the wider culture. But in its priestly mode, it's prayerful, contemplative, and mystical. Without the leavening of the priestly, Newman contends, the prophetic dimension devolves in short order into a dry rationalism. The moral Michal might be read as the prophetic side of religion, and the dancing David as the priestly side of religion, which refuses to be constrained by reason alone. And with that, without proper conclusion, I'll bring the talk to a close. So thanks for listening so carefully.
Well, once again, thanks so much for listening to the Word on Fire show. We hope you enjoyed this talk from Bishop Barron titled David Dancing Before the Ark. I want to encourage you to pick up your copy of Bishop Barron's commentary on 2 Samuel. If you liked what you heard in this talk, there's so much more in the book. So just visit wordonfire.org/Samuel and be sure to use that special coupon code. The code is SAM5, that's SAM5. And when you use that during checkout, you'll save $5 on the 2 Samuel commentary. Well, thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next week in studio with Bishop Barron on the Word on Fire show.